It was May 15, 2025. Sherpa Palchen Tamang stood just below the Hillary Step, one of the deadliest bottlenecks on Mount Everest, staring down at a man who was slowly dying right in front of him. The climber's oxygen was almost gone. His legs barely responded anymore. The man he had been guiding, Subrata Ghosh from Bengal, sat frozen in the snow, delirious and refusing to move even an inch. They were only 300 vertical feet from the summit, yet one simple, terrible decision now stood between them and never seeing home again. Palchen had tried for hours. He had begged, pulled, dragged, waited, and pleaded, but Subrata would not budge. Staying any longer meant certain death for both of them. So, in the end, Palchen turned around and walked away. This was not merely a failed summit attempt. It cracked something much deeper inside the world of high-altitude climbing. The Sherpas are leaving, and once you truly understand why, you will never look at Everest the same way again. Welcome to the extreme edge. To understand why Palchen was forced to make such an agonizing choice, you first need to understand who the Sherpas really are. And I guarantee you, it is nothing like what most people imagine. Sherpas are an indigenous ethnic group from the high Himalayan regions of Nepal and northern India. For centuries, they have lived in some of the highest inhabited places on Earth. Because of this extraordinary heritage, many picture Sherpas as almost mythical figures, spiritual mountain guardians who are somehow naturally built for extreme altitude, who do not feel pain or fear the way the rest of us do. But that romantic image is not only wrong, it is dangerously misleading. Sherpas are ordinary human beings. They have families who worry about them. They get scared, they feel pain, and they die just like anyone else. The only real difference is that they have been doing this for so long that they have become incredibly skilled at hiding how terrified they actually are. Let me tell you about a man named Ong Dorje Sherpa. In 1996, during one of the deadliest seasons in Everest's history, Ong Dorje earned a reputation for courage that still echoes through every base camp tent today. When a violent whiteout cyclone trapped climbers high on the mountain, he refused to hunker down and wait it out. Instead, he clipped into the fixed ropes, turned his headlamp straight into the teeth of the storm, and climbed back up toward the south summit, trying desperately to reach Rob Hall and Doug Hansen. While most teams were simply fighting to survive inside their shredded tents, Ong Dorje pushed upward until hurricane-force gusts and blinding spin drift literally knocked him off his feet and forced him back down. Sadly, 8 climbers died that season, including his boss and close friend Rob Hall. In the aftermath, witnesses found Ong Dorje standing alone in the screaming wind, sobbing inconsolably over the loss of Rob. Those who knew him understood exactly why he was so devastated. As one friend later explained, Ong Dorje saw his purpose on this earth as keeping people safe. Even though Rob was the official expedition leader, Ong Dorje felt it was his personal responsibility to protect Rob Hall, Doug Hansen, and everyone else on the team. So when they died, he could not help but blame himself. The climbing world hailed the Western guides as heroes for trying to save their clients. And they were. But here is the part of the story that almost no one talks about. Ong Dorje survived, yet the weight of that survival nearly destroyed him. He came down with frostbitten cheeks and fingers so swollen he could not hold a cup. He spent weeks recovering in Kathmandu. His family had no idea whether he was alive or dead for days. And when he finally recovered enough to climb again, nobody asked if he was okay. They simply expected him to be ready to risk his life for the next group of clients. Because that is the unspoken deal every Sherpa makes when they take this job. They are not just guides. They are essentially human insurance policies. When something goes wrong, and something almost always goes wrong, the Sherpa is expected to fix it no matter what the personal cost may be. But here is what really bothers so many people about this arrangement. The expectation only goes one way. Even the most successful Sherpas face this harsh reality. Take Ong Charing Sherpa, for example. He is basically royalty in the climbing world, founder of Asian Trekking, one of Nepal's largest expedition companies, former president of the Nepal Mountaineering Association, the kind of guide that wealthy clients specifically request and pay premium prices to have on their team. This is a man who has been decorated by the King of Belgium, who has led expeditions for decades, and who helped build much of the infrastructure that makes modern Everest climbing possible. He has achieved more success than almost any Sherpa in the industry, and yet, even someone at the very top of the profession is still expected to risk everything for his clients without hesitation. He still watches young Sherpas from his own community die while trying to save people who probably should not have been on the mountain in the first place. He remains part of a system where Sherpa lives are quietly considered less valuable than Western dreams of adventure. Even Ong Charing, with all his success and recognition, cannot change the fundamental equation. When a wealthy climber gets into trouble, the Sherpa risks everything to save them. But when a Sherpa is the one hanging off a cliff, when a Sherpa is the one suffocating in the death zone, who exactly comes running to their rescue? Almost no one. When a Western climber dies, we get detailed news articles about their life, their dreams, and the grieving family waiting back home. When a Sherpa dies, they are lucky if their name is even mentioned. Usually they are simply referred to as a local guide or support staff. That single detail tells you everything you need to know about whose life the climbing industry truly values more. And this is not some recent development. This imbalance has existed for decades. Tenzing Norgay Sherpa, the man who first summited Everest alongside Edmund Hillary in 1953, was essentially written out of history for years. Most people still do not even know his full name, even though he was arguably the more experienced climber of the two. The myth of the superhuman Sherpa has created this dangerous expectation that these men, and they are almost always men, should be willing to die for people who would not do the same for them. Somehow, we have convinced ourselves that this is not only normal but noble. But what happens when the people we expect to sacrifice everything finally say no? What happens when they decide their own lives are worth more than someone else's bucket list adventure? That is exactly what is starting to happen on Everest right now. And what happened to Palchen Tamang and Subrata Ghosh was only the beginning. To truly understand what unfolded on that mountain, you need to know exactly how this nightmare played out, hour by hour and decision by decision. Palchen Tamang was a veteran Sherpa guide who had already completed several Everest climbs. He was a compact, quiet man who moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent half his life in thin air. He had guided everyone from wealthy CEOs to nervous first-timers, and he had learned to spot trouble long before it started. But nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for Subrata Ghosh. From their very first meeting, Palchen sensed something was off. Not obviously wrong, but definitely off. Subrata had that unmistakable look in his eyes, the wild-eyed excitement that experienced guides have learned to fear. It was the look that says, "I am here to conquer this mountain," rather than, "I am here to climb this mountain." There is a profound difference, and on Everest that difference has killed many people. The expedition manager, Bhadraj Bandari, would later tell reporters that Subrata was overly excited and repeatedly ignored warnings. But being a Sherpa guide means you cannot simply turn down a paying client just because they seem a little too eager. You cannot say, "Sorry, sir, but your eyes are shining a bit too brightly for my comfort." You take the job, you accept the risk, and you hope your experience can compensate for their enthusiasm. On the night of May 14th, when Subrata insisted on starting the summit push at 10 p.m. instead of the usual midnight or later, Palchen felt the first real spike of fear. This was not the normal Everest fear that climbers eventually learn to live with. This was something deeper, an instinct screaming that something very bad was coming. Most climbers begin their summit attempt between midnight and 2 a.m. because they need to reach the top by late morning and descend before the afternoon weather turns lethal. Starting too early meant they would be alone on the upper mountain with no other teams around to help if disaster struck, and no fresh reports about conditions higher up. They would essentially be climbing blind. But Subrata did not care. He would not listen to any warnings. He had trained for years for this moment. He had paid tens of thousands of dollars. He wanted to go. So at 10 p.m. they started climbing. Imagine what it is like to guide someone through the death zone. It is like being responsible for a toddler, except this toddler weighs 180 pounds and genuinely believes they are invincible. Every few minutes you have to turn around and check. Are they still moving? Are they clipped incorrectly? Are they showing signs of altitude sickness? All while your own body is slowly shutting down and your own brain is starving for oxygen. For the first few hours things went okay. Not perfect. Subrata was moving painfully slowly even by Everest standards, but okay enough. They passed the balcony at 27,500 feet, probably around 4 a.m. given their slow pace. They were still barely on schedule. By sunrise, they were only 1,000 feet from the summit. At sea level, that distance is nothing, a casual 15-minute walk. But at 28,000 feet, in hurricane-force winds and already exhausted, that same distance meant another 3 or 4 hours of brutal effort. Then the wind really began to hit. If you have never experienced wind at 28,000 feet, You cannot possibly imagine it. This is not a storm at sea level. This is wind that strikes you like a solid wall, wind that can literally lift you off your feet and throw you off the mountain. It was exactly the kind of wind that makes even the most experienced climbers turn around and head down. At that altitude, the route to the summit is a knife-edge ridge, sometimes only a foot wide, with a 10,000-foot drop into Tibet on one side and an 8,000-foot drop into Nepal on the other. You are balancing on a tightrope of ice and rock where, even without wind, one wrong foot placement means instant death. Now add 60-mile-per-hour gusts to that equation. Every blast tries to rip you off that narrow ridge. You have to lean hard into it, time your steps between gusts, and cling to the fixed rope like your life depends on it, because it does. Palchen had climbed through such winds before, but Subrata had never experienced anything like it. This was his first time on Everest. Palchen tried to check on his client, and that must have been the moment he first realized, with growing dismay, that things were not right. Subrata kept falling farther behind schedule with every switchback. Did Palchen signal him? Did he use the universal mountaineering gesture that means, "We need to go down"? We do not know. Either way, Subrata either did not see it or refused to see it. He simply kept putting one foot in front of the other, painfully slow, but determined to reach the summit. Now you might be wondering, why on earth didn't Palchen just call the whole thing off? Clearly, he must have known Subrata was no longer acting rationally. But here is something most people do not understand about guiding on Everest. You cannot physically force an adult client to turn around. You cannot grab a grown man and drag him down the mountain when he is absolutely determined to keep going up. All you can do is advise strongly and pray they listen. Subrata did not listen. Finally, at around 2 p.m., roughly 13 hours after they had started climbing, they reached the summit. Subrata raised his arms in triumph, pulled out his camera, and posed for the photos that would prove to everyone back home that he had done it. Palchen probably stood off to the side, quietly checking his oxygen gauge for the 100th time, watching the clouds building in the south, feeling the wind growing stronger, and calculating how much time they had left. The math was brutally simple and terrifying. They had already been climbing for 13 hours. They had maybe 4 hours of oxygen remaining. The descent would take at least 6 hours in good conditions. In these winds, it could easily take 8. Palchen knew they were in serious trouble. But here is the unspoken rule of being a Sherpa guide. You do not get to panic. You do not get to show fear, because the moment your client sees terror in your eyes, they stop functioning entirely. So Palchen buried his own fear, pointed down the mountain, and began the descent. The first hour went better than he had expected. Subrata was exhausted and stumbling every few steps, but he was still moving. They made it past the south summit and the Cornice Traverse. Every step felt like a small miracle. Every minute stretched their luck thinner and thinner. Then they reached the Hillary step. Picture the scene. You are at 28,700 feet. The air is so thin your body is literally dying cell by cell. Below you is a 10,000-foot drop into nothingness. Above you is a 40-foot wall of rock and ice that you must down-climb backwards while already exhausted in hurricane-force winds. And that is exactly when Subrata sat down in the snow and spoke 4 words that changed everything. I can't see anything now. Sudden blindness at extreme altitude is not uncommon. When the brain does not receive enough oxygen, vision is often one of the first things to fail. Palchen had seen it before. He knew exactly what to do. Get the client down fast before the altitude sickness grew worse. But then Subrata said something that made Palchen's blood run cold. I won't move. Let that sink in. At 28,700 feet, in the middle of the death zone, with rescue impossible and oxygen running out, Subrata did not collapse or pass out. He made a conscious decision to stop trying. Experienced survival experts call this give-up-itis. When the human brain is pushed beyond its limits, sometimes it simply quits. Not dramatically, not with screams or fighting. It just decides that sitting down and dying is easier than taking one more step. But understanding the phenomenon does not make it any less terrifying when you are watching it happen to the person you are responsible for. What followed was 8 hours that would haunt Palchen for the rest of his life. First, he tried talking in broken English in Nepali in the universal language of desperation. He brought up everything he could think of. Subrata's family waiting at home, the celebration that would greet him upon his return, how close they were to safety. But how do you reason with someone whose brain has already begun to shut down? When words failed, Palchen did something that goes far beyond any job description or any amount of money he was being paid. He decided to physically drag his client to safety. Imagine that for a moment. Walking at sea level is tiring enough. Now imagine dragging another full-grown adult at 28,700 feet, where every step feels like running a marathon and your own body is shutting down minute by minute from lack of oxygen. Palchen's muscles screamed for oxygen that simply was not there. His back bent under the weight. His own vision began to blur from the effort. And after 4 excruciating hours of heroic struggle, they had moved only 300 feet. That was when Palchen finally collapsed in the snow beside Subrata. Both men were gasping in the thin air. It was now painfully clear they were both dying, just at different speeds. Lying there, Palchen faced a decision that no amount of training can ever prepare you for. His oxygen gauge hovered near empty. He had been in the death zone for almost 20 hours. Frostbite was already claiming his fingers and toes. His own body was beginning to shut down. The math was brutally simple. Stay and both die, or leave and maybe, just maybe, one of them survives. Palchen stayed longer than he should have. His own survival had become a coin toss. When he finally stood up to leave, Subrata was still conscious, still sitting in the snow, still refusing to move. Did they make eye contact? Did Palchen say goodbye? Did he promise to send help, knowing that at 28,700 feet help was impossible? We will never know. What we do know is that Palchen chose life while Subrata chose the alternative. As Palchen descended, the journey nearly killed him. Without oxygen, his brain began to malfunction. He started hallucinating, seeing people who were not there and hearing voices in the wind. At one point, he could not even remember where he was or why he was walking alone through the snow. His body moved on pure autopilot, following routes burned into muscle memory from years of climbing. Left at this rock, right at that ice formation, clip in here, rest there. All while his conscious mind floated somewhere between life and death. Somehow, and even Palchen does not fully remember how, he stumbled into Camp 4 at sunrise. Other climbers found him suffering from severe frostbite, speaking incoherently, more dead than alive. It took him days to recover enough to explain what had happened up there in the darkness near the Hillary Step. When Sherpa search teams finally braved the mountain to look for Subrata, they found him exactly where Palchen had left him. Still sitting in the same position, frozen solid in the exact spot where he had decided not to move. When news of the incident broke, the internet exploded. Some people called Palchen a hero for trying as long as he did. Others called him a coward for walking away. Keyboard warriors who had never climbed higher than their own stairs debated whether he had made the right choice. But the truth is far simpler and far more uncomfortable. Palchen should never have been put in that position in the first place. Here is something the adventure tourism industry desperately does not want you to know. Sherpas are quitting. Not just switching companies or taking a season off, they are leaving Everest entirely and telling their sons to do literally anything else for a living. And when you dig into the reasons why, the picture that emerges is chilling. Most Sherpas are now whispering, and some are saying it outright, that Everest is no longer the mountain their fathers climbed. The numbers prove it. In 1996, considered a busy year at the time, fewer than 100 people reached the summit. By 2023, that number had exploded to more than 650. Imagine 650 people trying to climb the world's most dangerous mountain in a single season. It is like turning a Formula 1 racetrack into rush hour traffic, except this racetrack is made of shifting ice, hidden crevasses that open overnight, and avalanche zones that change by the hour. The Hillary Step, where Palchen and Subrata became trapped, now regularly has actual lines of climbers waiting their turn. Real queues on Mount Everest at 28,800 feet. Every minute you wait is a minute closer to death. And who is managing this chaos? Who is setting up the safety ropes, carrying the extra oxygen tanks, and making sure all these inexperienced climbers do not kill themselves? The Sherpas. But here is the part that should make anyone angry. Most of these clients have no business being on Everest. Veteran guides and peer-reviewed data suggest that as many as 2/3 of people attempting the mountain have never even been above 20,000 feet before. It is like showing up to perform brain surgery because you watched a YouTube tutorial. And when these unprepared climbers inevitably get into trouble, which happens constantly, who risks their life to save them? The Sherpas. They are no longer just guides. They have become babysitters, bodyguards, emergency medical technicians, and suicide prevention counselors all rolled into one. They are expected not only to guide people up the mountain but to keep them alive when their terrible decisions finally catch up with them. And they are paid almost nothing to do it. A Sherpa guide might earn between $3,000 and $5,000 for an entire season that could easily kill him. Meanwhile, clients are paying $50,000 to $100,000 for the privilege of being guided. You do the math. The people taking the biggest risks are getting paid the least. But money is not even the worst part. The worst part is what this system is doing to Sherpa families and entire communities. Traditional Sherpa culture has always had a deep spiritual connection to the mountains. To them, Everest or Komolungma is not merely a tourist destination. It is sacred. It is literally a goddess in their religion. But when your sacred mountain becomes a conveyor belt for thrill seekers, when your sons and fathers are dying to help strangers take selfies at 29,000 feet, how long can that spiritual connection survive? Many Sherpa families are now actively discouraging their children from becoming guides. They are pushing them toward education, toward jobs in the cities, toward anything that does not involve risking their lives so that someone else can check an item off a bucket list. And honestly, who can blame them? What happened to Palchen Tamang was not just a tragic accident. It was the inevitable result of a completely broken system. The real tragedy is not that Subrata Ghosh died. The real tragedy is that his death was entirely preventable. If he had listened to his guide's advice, if he had shown even a fraction of the respect the mountain demands instead of trying to conquer it, both men would probably have made it home safely. But that would have required something our modern adventure tourism culture no longer seems to value: humility. For me, the courage Palchen showed, trying for 8 long hours to save Subrata in the death zone, is nothing short of incredible. But what is even more incredible is that he was ever put in that position in the first place. And the deepest tragedy is not what happened in those final moments at the Hillary step. The deepest tragedy is that we have built an entire industry around the expectation that some people should be willing to die for other people's adventures. And the very people who have carried that burden for decades are finally saying no. Maybe it is time we started listening to them. What do you think Palchen should have done? Should he have stayed with Subrata even if it meant both of them dying? Or did he make the only rational choice possible in that impossible situation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.